It's pretty common for people to criticize venture capital for pouring billions of dollars into business ideas that a lot of which ultimately fail. We've certainly seen our share of this in ag tech, but there's also a compelling case for the good that ag tech venture capital can do, especially when it involves farmers in the process.
That's why we've tried to shift the farmers to a different position in the value chain, and why we're aligning them through farmer-driven innovation to actually help build the products of the future.
Spencer Stensrude at Ag Ventures Alliance joins Pete Nelson and Margaret Oldham from AgLaunch to talk about their models for farmer-led innovation. They believe investing in early-stage ag companies can have big benefits for farmers and rural communities.
Think about what this means on the ground. It means more jobs in rural and in underserved urban communities. It means some small farmers are now in the venture business.
Both AgLaunch and Ag Ventures Alliance give us unique and fascinating models for how venture capital can be a force for good for not only entrepreneurs and investors, but for advancing the ag industry.
What really makes that work is that at the heart of everything, both organizations put the farmer first.
Farmer-led innovation on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow Ag Nerd. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Tim Hamrich. Every week, you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, innovators, and investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. And before we dive into today's episode, I want to take just a moment to recognize our quarterly presenting sponsor, which this quarter is Headstorm, engineering growth for the farms of tomorrow. Headstorm is a full-service technology consultancy with been there, done that knowledge and expertise in the ag industry. The team at Headstorm knows which digital strategies work and which ones don't work based on the competitive landscape across broadacre, specialty, and animal ag industries. Headstorm provides a holistic and actionable technology roadmap that bridges the gap between strategy and implementation. From inception to execution, they help you play to your strengths, mitigate your weaknesses, and make technology your unfair advantage. Learn more at headstorm.com. That's headstorm.com. I'll leave a link for it in the show notes. And thank you to Headstorm for supporting Ag Innovation and the Future of Agriculture podcast. All right, now back to today's featured conversation with Pete Nelson and Margaret Oldham from AgLaunch and Spencer Stensrude at Ag Ventures Alliance. If you've been a long-time listener to this show, and I do mean really long-time listener, you've heard from Spencer back on episode 68, which took place in 2017, and Pete on episode 117 in 2018. I can't believe that has been 6 or 7 years ago. Now, I'll link to those classics in the show notes if you'd like to go back and listen to them. But since that time, these two organizations have joined forces in a lot of ways and partnered together based on a shared mission of investing in farmer-led innovations. They each have unique aspects to their respective models, which I'll let Pete, Margaret, and Spencer describe to you here later in today's episode. But they're joining forces in a way that puts the farmer at the center of investing in and incubating early-stage ag tech companies and supporting the founders of those companies. There are really some interesting points brought up in this conversation, points that I've been thinking a lot about since we recorded about 2 months ago or so. Things like, should billion-dollar unicorn exits be the measure of success for venture capital, and the way that we kind of determine whether or not venture capital in agriculture is working? Or maybe should we look at the number of viable, lasting companies that have sustained through it and become profitable? Or maybe we should look at jobs and the economic impact to rural communities. We also address the fact that venture capital gets poured into so many businesses that ultimately fail, and whether that's a feature or a bug when it comes to advancing agriculture. And does the fact that we are in a commodity-driven business mean that, by definition, all of the value that is created by these companies, that is invested by these investors, will ultimately just get squeezed out and extracted by low-cost producers, being that it's a commodity business? Some really thought-provoking questions that I think you'll enjoy pondering as you listen to Spencer, Margaret, and Pete. Spencer Stensrude invests at the intersection of transformational technology and agriculture. He's the CEO of AgVentures Alliance, which is a farmer-owned cooperative with a mission to increase farm profitability. They make venture capital investments in startups with a direct impact on farmers. Before joining AgVA, he started and operated some small businesses, invested in income-producing real estate, and worked in the commercial lending industry. Pete Nelson has been experimental farming, venture investing, and creating innovation hubs in agriculture with farmers across the U.S. and Canada since 1997. He's currently co-founder and president of AgLaunch, a nationally recognized farmer-led innovation platform for advancing the next generation of agricultural technologies. And Margaret Oldham is the vice president of innovation at AgLaunch. She's an experienced marketer and coach with a reputation for working with clients to implement successful marketing and training strategies in animal health, crop protection, and specialty crop segments. I'm going to drop you into the conversation here where Spencer is giving some background on AgVentures Alliance, and then Pete and Margaret will add more context on their missions and the relationship between these two organizations.
Well, AgVentures Alliance started back in 1998, so we've got a long history. We actually had a big 25th anniversary celebration this last year, and really was kind of a grassroots effort of farmers getting together to try to do something about the future of grain prices. That opportunity has changed over time. The first successful project was a farmer-owned ethanol plant. Now the opportunity is in startups, in ag tech, we believe. And I think it was back in 2018, the former CEO, Jude Conway, was on a panel with Pete from AgLaunch, and we realized like they had this really good model for doing farm trials that we wanted to bring to our farmers in Iowa. We kind of had the traditional farm trial value prop where it's like, call your favorite farmer that will try everything and ask them to test something, go do all the work, give us all the information back. If it works, you can buy it again next year. And the AgLaunch model totally flips that on its head. And it was just like 10 times better than the way that we were doing it. So we knew we wanted to work with them. At the same time, they were running an accelerator. We liked the accelerator. We went and did kind of our own independent analysis. This is where I came in at the time and determined that we thought they were kind of best in class for ag accelerators across the country. So we started just working really closely. We brought kind of some of our farmer investment selection model to their process and started investing in each of the companies that were accepted into the accelerator. And then they started helping us build a farm trial program for our farmer members.
Very cool. And Pete or Margaret, both of you, from the AgLaunch perspective, maybe you could shed more light on that.
I'll comment first. It never had occurred to me, even as the Climate Corps purchase happened and ag tech started kind of being a big thing, that people would not go to farmers right off the gate and view them more as just customers. We all know that farmers are all businesses, and it just never made sense to me that it seemed like either the farmer was being asked to do things for free, as Spencer mentioned, or kind of almost as last resort. We'll bring this product out when we're ready to go sell it. So very much sort of a B2C mindset and not a B2B mindset. And so that just never occurred to me. And so as we sort of percolated on that, we just felt like, of course, we need to do what we have already been doing with value-added crops, what Spencer and his group had done with ethanol, where they were adding value beyond the farm gate, and the development of technologies and leveraging data, looking for investment opportunities are just another way of thinking what many of us as farmers have thought for a long time. How do we get beyond the farm gate or have different optics along the value chain? And so it was very gratifying, frankly, to us. I'm used to chasing partners, and the fact that AgVA came to us, maybe one of the first in my career where we didn't do the chasing, but we just figured out we were aligned, was very gratifying. And I'm going to pass over to Margaret, because Margaret's the one who's really taken my crazy idea and Spencer's buy-in and now turned it into like a real product. So you probably have a point on this too, Margaret.
Yeah, I would just say that, I wasn't involved in the initial decision, but I've been involved in the aftermath of that decision. And I'm so grateful to have a partner like Spencer and the Ag Ventures Alliance crew. It is like a hand in glove fit. I feel like it's that good. And as Spencer said, we've had complementary elements of our programming that we've been able to extend the impact for each of our organizations. And I think what really makes that work is that at the heart of everything, both organizations put the farmer first.
Well put. Yeah. And Spencer, you were on in 2017. So at that time, Ag Ventures Alliance is somewhere around 20 years old. I wish I would have at that time screenshotted what your portfolio looked like on your website, because I think it is at least tripled, probably more, since that time, a portfolio of companies. I know you said, part of your arrangement is you invest in those that go through the AgLaunch program. Is that where a lot of these investment opportunities are coming from? Or maybe talk about the growth in that time.
Yeah, we do have a lot of overlap with the AgLaunch companies, and that program has grown. So that's added a lot of startups to our portfolio over the years. But I would say we have kind of shifted our strategy, and it takes time to kind of learn this. And really, venture is a little bit of I really think it's kind of an underground world sometimes. Like, there's not a lot of people doing it. There's not a lot of people sharing about it. That's getting better over time. And then, kind of under my direction, we've kind of shifted from maybe a more concentrated investment approach to a little bit more dispersed investment approach. And so yeah, you're right, Tim. I think it's probably at least triple. We're sitting at 54 active portfolio companies today, and plan to continue to grow that.
And Pete, part of your model also is investing in these companies as well. Is that right?
Yeah, we've been, the original model was work with aligned investors. And so AgVA is a perfect example of that. It's a group of farmers that are making an investment out of a legacy co-op. So that's as aligned as probably you can get, with a goal of how do you help farm income, farmer opportunities, and benefit the founders at the same time with that alignment. And so that group of farmers, we call them points. They're getting points for helping us find deals, screening what deals we work on. There's a committee that then decides who we invest in and who we push forward, field trials, data. And so, similar to when in the early days at AgVA, when they were delivering corn loads to the ethanol plant and had put capital in to get a return, change the basis number at the farm gate and change the return, our farmers are getting vested and organized. And what's really cool about it is Ag Ventures Alliance runs the back office of all that. And so that's just another way as we kind of, marry these aligned ideas. So our farmers have become, throughout the Mississippi Delta or Appalachia or other regions we work in, are now also AgVA members, and they use their institutional skills at building an early generation co-op to help build what we would consider the next generation co-ops, leveraging data, brain power, and all that into this portfolio. So it's really cool. The second pool of funders we've worked with traditionally have been companies that are licensed by USDA as rural business investment companies. And so those would be the Open Prairies, the Lewis and Clarks, the Innovas. That alignment is, if you're Farm Credit and you've loaned 40% of the overall farm loans in this country, you have a vested interest, whether it's because of climate, geopolitical, changing market forces, in making sure you have solvent farmers that you can loan money to. So we see these technologies, and the alignment is about growing a technology stack that obviously creates good exits for the founders, good returns for the LPs. But when the farm credits are involved, that LP pool has this added benefit of, we want to return more than they'd return making loans, and we want to create farmers that are more bankable long term and more resilient. And so that's the other big pool. And as we think for the future of us, and we get better and better at doing that, collectively between AgVA and AgLaunch, we're exploring how do we create more interesting fund models that build directly on what we're doing, including the due diligence we're able to do with the farmers. And I got one more that's interesting to the model, and that is many VC funds talk about we're not just putting money in, but we're helping guide the companies, or we're supporting, or we're providing networks and all that. And that may be true, but if you think about that in a business model, you're taking LP money and management fees to do ancillary services that are not really how much time, when is there scope creep, can you provide the best services? So our model is taking that on the head. We have an entire nonprofit organization that's a $2 million a year budgeted organization funded by the federal government, philanthropy, others that have similar long-term goals as us, that provide the field team, provide the accelerator support, provide the mentor networks, all without using LP money. So when Spencer and his team are writing a check, they're writing a check and contributing to an ecosystem that's part of the model. And so we call that the non-dilutive investment, but it's substantial, it's growing, that feeds the infrastructure. And that really makes, when we think about our future fund that we're working on and our capital investors, makes it extremely unique, because we can follow through with companies and we have a full staff that supports them, all that are not coming out of LP dollars.
Right. Well, yeah, and you all have done a really good job of articulating kind of the growth of the programs, both AgLaunch and AgVentures Alliance, and how much it's grown just since our last interview, which doesn't seem that long ago. I know it actually was, 7 years ago or so. But I want to talk about, outcomes and impact, if you will. Like, the existential question, I guess, is, venture is known as a game that is often played where you just need a very small percentage of winners to kind of compensate for a lot of companies not making it. And in your case, you're thinking, if we have a closer connection with the farmer, that we can either improve the odds or at least improve the outcome, so you have that impact on rural communities that you just described. As you're going about doing this and continuing to grow, what is giving you the validation that this is working, that the thesis is playing out, at least in some ways, the way you thought it would? And Spencer, it's been a little bit since we've got back to you, so let's have you weigh in on this first.
Yeah, Tim, you might get a variety of answers on this one, actually. So thanks for asking. So first of all, I am a true believer in the power law, and that a few outcomes make a huge difference. And I think it's repeated everywhere we look, really. Like, outside of venture, people call it like the 80-20 rule. 20% of the cases generate 80% of the work, and whatever. It applies to almost everything. So I am a true believer in that power law. And impact wise, gosh, we've just kind of started to dive into this. We created like an annual report this year for the first time, and tried to look at some of the impact statistics, and it's pretty unbelievable. I don't think we can take credit for all of it, but being at the seed stage, or that first round of financing, is pretty key in helping these things kind of get off the starting line. So, gosh, 54 active companies in our portfolio. I think they had like something like $60 million in revenue and well over 400 employees in those companies. So pretty huge. I think it's closing in on like $1 billion in enterprise value that's been created by these startups. So yeah, the impact is huge. And really, like, I'll go on a little bit of a tangent here, but sometimes venture capital gets a bad rap. Like, people are like, oh, they're burning money, they're throwing money away. But at the end of the day, I kind of think that consumers and farmers and everyone who's going to use these future technologies should probably be thanking venture capital, because it wasn't their money that was burned. And the venture capital industry has this unique approach where they've designed it so that they can take the losses, and as long as they get to those power law outcomes, they deliver returns back to investors, and they bring the future a whole lot closer to us, because now there has been 100 different attempts at new technologies. Maybe 60 of those didn't work out, but there were 60 founding teams that learned what they need to do differently next time. So it gets a bad rap sometimes, but honestly, I have a hard time thinking of something that could be a bigger force for good for people.
Yeah. And follow up on that. A lot of times we use the metric of success as unicorn exits, billion-dollar exits, and the number of them we had. And we point to the fact that we haven't really had any in the past decade now. We can argue numbers, I guess, slightly, but we really haven't had any. Is that the wrong metric, or am I trying to move the goalposts to fit a narrative?
Well, I think it's good discussion. I would say that those next billion-dollar outcomes are just building right now, and they're going to be coming down the road a few years. So that's our thesis and why we're putting capital to work in the space. But I also think that sometimes it gets a little bit of a worse rap than it should, because there were also all the SPACs and several of those that were billion-dollar outcomes too. But everyone seems to forget about those, and those were just a few years ago.
They have the SPAC asterisk next to them. And that might even, I mean, you could maybe use that as evidence that billion-dollar exits are the wrong metric. Maybe they promote models that aren't very sustainable.
And honestly, Tim, this might make me just sound out of touch or crazier than I
love crazy ideas on the podcast. Go for it.
All right, good. Well, I've got one for you. So our farmer driven innovation model, which is what we call this, with where we're including farmers in the investment selection process, and then to trial and test the companies and to invest in them down the road. But I'm actually more concerned that we may miss out on the moonshots and the crazy ideas, because our advancement rates have been off the chart. I think the AgLaunch accelerator program has had like one write-off in the last 4 years. And accelerator stage, you should probably be expecting like 80% of those to be write-offs. So they're all kind of moving along and moving forward. But the things that I worry about are like, oh, did we miss that really crazy idea? What if that worked? What would have been different?
Okay, so yes, I know we're deep down a hole here, and I don't want to get out of it because I'm enjoying it too much, but let's bring Pete back in on this, which is another existential question, and I want to give you and Margaret both a chance to answer the first one, but before we go back, is there a risk in farmer-led innovation that the solutions have to be too close to commercialization? That, oh, well, CRISPR might have the opportunity to really change agriculture, but my farmer down the road's not worried about CRISPR. He or she is worried about, making money today. So is there that risk, or is that great? Because obviously, if only one has been a write-off, that seems like a good thing. How do you think about that?
This conversation's working for me, Tim, because I want to hear what Margaret has to say about it, and then I'll give you what I think about it. But I think we're learning and accommodating for the thinking that Spencer just laid out and what you're teasing. So, Margaret, is it okay to defer to you first?
Yeah, sure. So the question is like, are we going to miss the moonshot with farmer-driven selection because they're very focused on what will help them now? And I think the nice thing is that we also have a balance of Spencer being a part of that selection process, and the AgLaunch team as well. So, I would say that the longer shots are usually the last company selected, but we have some moonshots in there. I would also say that, there is that risk because we are looking for companies that have a prototype so they can get on the farm right away. But yet we have selected some that are definitely going to be industry changing if they hit. We're also always looking at new ways to bring companies in. So, for example, we have an established accelerator program. We've proven that model over the last 3 years. We continue to refine it and adapt to the particular cohort, but it's working. But this year, we recognized that there were some teams that, as Spencer said, maybe they are going to be moonshots, making your own fertilizer in a vat on the farm. I don't know. Maybe that's crazy. But we decided to do something called the pre-accelerator, where we're working with them really, really early on some really focused deliverables, because they're not quite ready for our accelerator and to go on the farm in full scale. So we're always adapting our model to try to help teams where they are. And I hope that that will allow us to still get some of those crazy, wacky things in the mix. But it is a watch out, I think.
I guess I have two things that overlap the conversation of both Spencer and Margaret's. One is we did an assessment with AgVA where we looked from 2016 to present and looked at our overlap investments and some of AgVA's in aggregate. And I think I've got my numbers here right. 58 companies, 5 exits, 5 write-offs, with about a 3.5x. And when you look at the 48 that are therefore still in play, they kind of skew from what I'd call good solid base hits, maybe some hardware that'll create 200 rural jobs and actually change the way we can do conservation tillage, to some things that are doing new ways to measure for bacteria and other pathogens in meat processing that could scale, right? So they range. So I think that's the kind of beauty of the model, is the potential to accommodate for both. So not the bloodbath of we're going to get 1 out of 10 that has to be a billion. And so from an LP perspective, you're managing the risks and you're getting these ancillary benefits. What is the impact for farmers? Can we plant more cover crops in years that it's too wet? Whatever those things are, you're getting a benefit. So that's one thought on the portfolio concept. But we share between the two organizations the idea that there's room for some big hits. That goes to the farmers. And I'll say for the AgLaunch farmer group, and I think the Midwest guys that Spencer was dealing with and are part of the AgVA might have had a different view on the front end, but we've sort of congealed around. At the beginning, Tim, when farmers were selecting technology with our model, they gravitated towards hardware that might be a planting attachment or something that we could see and touch, and it worked on their operation. Margaret has put together an entire training that we're going to roll out to additional farmers outside about helping farmers understand how venture capital works, what the multipliers are, what is the model. And the more we've trained farmers, we now have a cadre of farmers that include urban aquaponics to big scale grain folks in the Midwest, to organic, to high proportion of African American and women farmers that are now thinking like investors. So they're using their farm brains, but they're looking at portfolio management. We got to have some good things that could sell and could sell into big companies that would be game changers from a biotechnology perspective or an animal health perspective. We need some good ones that help us make grain bins more safe now. And we need to think about it like investors. And so as we sort of grounded the reality of the ground truthing on the farm with how investment works, and that's only going to get better for us in thinking about portfolio management.
I have a quick follow-up on that. Well, it may not be quick, but that's okay if it's not. How do you leverage and maximize the benefit of that diversity without reading too much into what one producer says? And I ask this because I think this is a mistake a lot of ag tech makes. You start off, you think everybody's going to want this. What farmer wouldn't want this? And then you talk to one farmer that says, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. There's no way I would ever use that. And here are the reasons why. Maybe they speak for all farmers, but in most cases, my argument would be they do not. So having, the diversity of farming systems, of backgrounds, of people, of geographies is probably pretty helpful. But how do you make it work for your benefit instead of just like having one farmer speak for all?
This is a huge problem, and it's a systematic problem within agriculture, whether it is a rural innovator approaching a group of farmers with a new crop or a new technology, is the lack of networks of farmers that understand how to think about the landscape, how to understand the push-pulls and the levers with all the other players in the value chain, all of those things, and the lack of ability to coordinate as a group makes everything you just said generally happen. You can have somebody really poo-poo an idea at a coffee shop. You can have somebody over hype it and everything in between. And what we're trying to do by having a well-trained and diverse perspective of farmers that are systematized is to mitigate against that. So I'm going to punt to you, if you don't mind, Margaret, and just maybe talk about practically how we do that with the processes and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was almost like, ooh, let me answer this one. So Spencer knows that. So we have 40 to 50 farmers in our network. We are actively recruiting farmers who want to be a part of that now, where we have a footprint and can service that. But we've developed a system that I think is working really well. Super excited about it. We start with the farmer vote. So every farmer in the network gets a voice. They get a chance to vote on the value to the industry, the value to their farm, whether they'd be willing to trial it. And we use a score from that to then narrow down teams, the entrepreneurs that we'll work with. And then once they've gone through what we call a challenge week, where we get to really look under the hood, know more about the founder, know more about their technology. We award AgLaunch bucks. This was a great idea from Spencer last year to gamify and make it fun. And to Pete's point, to make them think like investors. So they were awarded $100,000 of AgLaunch bucks, and they could assign that value to any of the teams that were in the challenge weeks. And from there, narrowed it down further. Our selection committee then makes the final decision. And that selection committee is carefully selected to be representative of our membership. So yes, we had 2 female farmers, one from Oregon, one from Arkansas. We had an African-American farmer from Tennessee who raises vegetables. We had a large-scale farmer from Tennessee and one large-scale farmer from Iowa as well. And then Spencer in there to also give insight. So that selection committee is also carefully designed to be representative of our membership. And we'd like for them to have completed the investment training that Pete mentioned and really have that head on their shoulders about, like, how does this help our portfolio? And I'll give you an example of how that works. One year, one of the farmers on the committee said, we were really debating, like, this last company, whether we should bring them in or not. And he just asked the question, do we have any technology like this in our portfolio today? And is this a category that we should be interested in? And the answer was no and yes. And so we brought that company in. So I love the way that model is working. I love that all farmers have a voice in the process, but we have a somewhat trained and experienced team of representative farmers that make that final decision. And Spencer, I bet you've got something to add to that.
Yeah, well, I think that applies to the accelerator selection process for sure. But Tim, I would maybe kind of check your assumption there. Do we think it's any different outside of ag? I mean, it's hard to build a successful business no matter where you are, I think. What do you think about that, Tim?
Oh, I think it's absolutely hard. I think where the motivation on the question comes from is probably spending too much time on Twitter, where everybody has a point of view and then everybody wants to generalize that point of view to categorize somebody, right? And so it's very hard to get honest feedback, first of all, on any idea. But second of all, even if you can get honest feedback, it's very hard to contextualize that into a market, right? And yeah, I think you're right. It's probably the same way. I've never worked outside of ag, but I assume probably the same goes for inside of ag or outside.
I think about this a lot too, because with farmers, theoretically, you're entrepreneurial, not theoretically and practical, you're entrepreneurial on crack in that you are taking huge amounts of risk with really generally not a great leverage position compared to everybody else in the chain. And so it may be that these early innovator farmers, I sometimes say they're more innovative than the 2.5%ers in other industry, specific to the circumstances of what it means to be a farmer and what needs to be aggregated in the way that our brains have to operate to farm. So I don't know the answer, but theoretically, there may be something special going on with farmers versus other industries where you do have a B2B relationship with folks that need to adopt. So it's very interesting to think about. And I've also kind of talk about the Twitter and the generalization. in a world where words are now loaded, even things that should be pretty benign like diversity, what we're understanding and demonstrating is that it is true. The more different perspectives, types of farming, types of business models, background, minority participation, all of those are sort of, depending on the audience, popular things right now, but they also are the best thing for being able to check what you were doing. Is there implicit bias in our decisions? Are we already loading on this startup because of whatever reason that might not be reality? Those are automatic checks by having this group that's very diverse from different backgrounds. And we think that's fundamental to the model. And we've talked about this a lot before. In the near term, you could probably grow something, and Spencer and his group could do it for corn and beans. It's Chicago board price times yield minus input. There's where Margaret was talking. This is the budget. How do we develop technologies in those crops at scale in the Midwest to accommodate for that? Because we believe the world's going to be exceedingly more diverse, interesting, carbon markets, different kinds of crops, whatever. We think a different sort of engine had to be built, and that seems to be what's happening.
Yep, and that actually goes directly back to a follow-up I was going to ask earlier when Pete, you mentioned kind of commodity prices too, which is, well, let me preface this by saying I'm an eternal optimist. I just play a skeptic on podcasts here, but the skeptical part of me thinks like, all right, we're trying to get all this innovation to the farm, which are in most cases producing commodity crops. By definition of a commodity, the market's going to find a way to squeeze all that value out, right? To lower the price of that commodity for people who want to consume it. How do we make sure that there is shared value here so we really get back to those outcomes we want?
Well, you hit the nail on the head, Tim, and that's I think that's why we knew we had to come up with a different way to do this. I've called it like the dependency problem. We've got like a dependency problem in ag, and farmers are dependent on a few suppliers. We've got government oversupply, structural oversupply in the government. We depend on certain markets that we can't impact. And then we depend on the weather to be favorable each year. And so when you've got all of those things kind of outside of your control, you've got to just look at things differently. That's why we've tried to shift the farmers to a different position in the value chain, and why we're aligning them through farmer-driven innovation to actually help build the products of the future. And when they do that, they're earning equity and can have opportunities to invest along the way. We started an angel network a while back where farmers actually put their own money to work in these startups. And so that's really the problem we're trying to solve here, is that until we decommoditize, which I think we are going to decommoditize over the long run, but until then, I think we have to just move farmers back into a position where there is more value. And we think that's helping develop better products for the rest of the farmers. And so when we say field trials, we're working with companies so early that it may not be like statistically significant small plot trials. Some of these things are like product development coaching. What breaks when we get to the field and how do we fix it? So that's that's really kind of the problem we're trying to solve here. And then the only other note on that, and I'm glad you're an optimist, Tim, because the pessimist may get to be right, but the optimist gets rich. So for all the listeners out there, remember that.
Your question about commodities in this discussion is extremely important. And so I want to just real briefly add, this group of organizations, AgLaunch and AgVA, are deeply interested in this. And we have this unique business model where, because we get funding for the nonprofit side, the fact that we are cooperatives of farmers, but we have a for-profit side that drives the business, allows us to think about it and think about it differently. And what you'll find in this space, whether it's on the ag tech side in terms of venture or on the value added side in terms of banking or USDA type loans is we're trying to bring a framework to really understand it. So we'll talk, biology would be an example, but this goes with any of this, new crop opportunities, whatever. There's 3 buckets of things that need to happen. Things that are necessary but don't make any money. That's the role of the university and the government. We don't have a sophisticated view of that. Things that are necessary is the next bucket, that are high capital cost with low margin. That's not a role for venture capital, but is necessary. And then things that are necessary, that there is this potential for a huge return, that are scalable, that are technologies where you have a relatively low capital cost leading to a big outcome. Those 3 buckets are not aligned right now. We see it as a fundamental leadership job of ours in the overall marketplace is helping line those up. It's not even clear how those go together, and it's totally inefficient. Now, use biology, we could use new crops, we could use a lot of sectors. But if you use biologics, it's very simple to see how the university's agronomic support, seeing what Spencer just described, these are all different modes of action with different principles, creating the extension environment for these things to flourish and making a bet that of course, is where the world's going to go. Those don't make money, but are necessary for it to work. We need all sorts of regional ability with cold storage and fermentation and a bunch of stuff I don't even fully understand from my gourd. Well, those are going to be like the ethanol businesses that Spencer and those guys built in the 90s, different type of funding models, different types of structures. And then the venture side, we've talked this whole conversation on. So a role here is appropriate placement of capital and alignment. And I would say that's a huge impediment to what we're doing in other groups that are like-minded is we don't have that alignment and honestly don't have enough sophisticated thinking in this overall environment to understand even those 3 buckets and how they should relate and where. So you get a bunch of one-offs and stuff just sort of tossed in the universe. So I just wanted to kind of point out that's part of the value add that leads to our investment thesis and our fund and our data models and everything that we've described is we're trying to lead an effort that makes sense in each of the regions we work on to align the public resources correctly, make sure they're funded, and then those other 2 buckets that need to be financed, but financed differently.
Sure. Well, if I could squeeze in maybe 2 more questions and then I promise I will let you go. But the first one being is I just want to look forward for a minute here about, hopefully we get you back on the podcast quicker than 6 or 7 years in this case. But if we do 5 years from now, what are we going to be talking a lot more about then that we're not talking about today? And Margaret, if you want to, I'll let you start if you'd like.
Ooh, I was hoping you'd go to Spencer or Pete first on that one. But I do think we will be talking more about the successes from automation, from some of the soil health plays. The biologicals may have shaken out a bit more by then. I think we'll be still looking to new technologies around climate smart, biosecurity, those kind of measures. I think we'll be talking about additional growth. And I believe we will have some of those big successes, those big impacts. So I think in 5 years, the nutrient dense crops, I think we'll be talking about a lot of crops that we don't really think of today. We've got a diverse group of farmers that are already growing some diverse crops, but there are new things that are coming that are very, very interesting to see. So that's my thought. I can't wait to hear what Pete and Spencer have because they tend to think a little bit broader, longer version than I do.
I hate to disappoint Margaret. I've got a lot of theories on different like segments and sectors, but in short, I think it's more of everything. I think we're in this kind of like age of acceleration where everything is coming at us faster and faster and faster. And so I think opportunity also is going to accelerate and come at us faster. But at the same time, there's going to be more and more volatility. But to me, I think we've got a nice math equation, acceleration and volatility that's going to provide a lot of opportunity. So more of everything, Tim.
I don't know. I can keep up with more. I feel like I need less. Pete.
I would expect outside of us, but hopefully we'll have some influence on this. We will have a much better understanding, and I'm a loosely group, how we're going to measure sustainability and the value of that. Carbon being the first one. Now we're into water, but worker well-being, reduction of chemical. We're going to have a better understanding, and it'll be very much clearer who are some of the early losers, who are some of the early winners. And what's complicated about that is it's geopolitical, it's global, it's government, it's companies trying to get in. But how we measure what it means to farm along the sustainability framework, one. Two, I think in 5 years we'll have, and Spencer and I talk about this a lot with things, all these schemes and Bitcoins and ETFs and all this DAOs and all this stuff. But we'll have a different, more interesting set of tools on how we finance agriculture and how the markets work. And the third big one is, we're going to begin to see and accelerate in general the changing migratory patterns of humans based on climate change and what we've now seen the last 70 years, and practically how farming works, where it works, what crops go. We're going to have a much bigger understanding of even if zones are getting changed and all those things. So I think that likely, I would say things will happen in those three that affect all the other things, including what it would mean to have a profitable startup or whatever. In the midst of that, and Margaret's going to shoot me, but I'm going to say it, we would humbly like to have the right group of farmers. And this is very difficult. It took from 7 years to go from 2 farmers to 44. Is that because we couldn't find candidates or people didn't want to or whatever? It's because it's really hard to work with farmers and get everybody aligned. This culture we're building is difficult. There's some number that's in the hundreds, maybe upper hundreds, that are the right farmers with the right soil types and mindsets strategically across the country that really give us churn on how we can grow and build innovation into all these markets. So I expect us to be there. I expect, as I think both Spencer and Margaret said, to have delivered good returns from what we've currently got in the pipeline back to our farmers, and beginning to see some rewards from the next fund back to the investors. And in all that, I think if we pull that off, think about what this means on the ground. It means more jobs, like Spencer said earlier, in rural and in underserved urban communities. It means some small farmers, small African-American farmers in our region, others that might have been a little on the sideline but are amazingly innovative people, are now in the venture business. They've seen the result of returns of technology and all that. And from our perspective, our data models and all that lead us to be driving technologies more to outcomes that fit some of the questions you said. What would be a better world? More nutrient-dense crops, more diversity, more jobs, all those things.
All right. Well, with that, that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much to Margaret, Pete, and to Spencer for being on the show. Of course, I will leave links in the show notes where you can go learn more about Ag Ventures Alliance and AgLaunch. Highly recommend you go take a look at their portfolio. If you're an entrepreneur of an early stage ag company, get in touch with those folks because they are looking for you. And I think these are great programs that I fully support. I keep meaning to make it out to Memphis for one of their field days that AgLaunch has. And I know Spencer and I have had several conversations about someday making it out to Iowa, but very, very cool programs, unique models and approaches, and much needed in this ag industry. So it was a pleasure to welcome all three of them on the podcast. And in the case of Spencer and Pete, have them back on after several years. So we'll have to make sure it doesn't go another 7 years or so before they're on again. But great work they're doing there. Thank you so much to all three of them again for being on the show. Thanks as well to Headstorm for being our quarterly presenting sponsor this quarter. Learn more about them at headstorm.com. And last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.